The Bet by Anton Chekhov. Once upon a time, on a really dark, stormy night out in Russia in the late 1800s, there was a party in a mansion. As rain hit the windows of this large building, we sort of go inside and we see this vast table spread with all sorts of wonderful food, desserts, and delicacies. And seated at the head of the table is a young banker. He's got jet black hair and a beard. He's surrounded by friends and sycophants and people who are laughing and spilling their wine out of their goblets drunkenly. And it's clear that this man is at the center of everything that's happening in sort of this mansion and the society. And he expounds on a philosophical idea that he believes to his rapt attention onlookers. He says, "Well, I think that the death penalty is the only way to go when it comes to capital punishment. Why, if you were to, say, incarcerate the victim instead of killing them, incarcerate them for their entire lives, why, that would be even more humane. For aren't you robbing them of the ability to be free, and isn't freedom worth more than life?" And most of the people in the party sort of laugh and shake it off. But there was another sort of down the table who says, "Well, I think that both incarceration and the death penalty are both really bad." To this, the banker waves his hand and he says, "Nonsense, nonsense. Long incarceration by far is way worse." When all of a sudden, there is a younger lad, and we're going to call him Young Man, at the other far end of the table. And upon hearing all of this, he slams his own goblet of wine down on the table and stands up to the shock of everybody around. And he says, pointing his finger across the table at the banker, "You are wrong. And I want to prove it to you. I would much rather be incarcerated, foregoing all of my freedom, than ever be subject to the death penalty." And the banker, noticing the reaction of the crowd, sort of looks to the right, looks to the left, smiling slyly, noticing that the young man is sort of a little whippersnapper and is probably just trying to gain attention, says very sinisterly, "Are you willing to put money down on that claim?" To which the young man replies, "Absolutely." And the banker says, "Done. I bet you 2 million that you would not be able to withstand 5 years in complete and total isolation." To which the young man responds, 2 million for 5 years? Make it 2 million for 15 years. The crowd goes completely silent. And after a moment, the banker throws back his head in just riotous laughter. "What a fool! Raising the time and not the price. It's a deal. I will set up the arrangements next week." And so it was that the bet was made. The following week, the young man did go to the banker's house as promised, and the banker, is so wealthy. The young man gets to his house. It's obviously this vast villa with so many windows, this long gravel front, place where horses and carriages can come, because this is the late 1800s. Servants, butlers, dressed in all black and white like penguins, maids running about. And the young man does seem a little bit dwarfed by the banker's vast estate. But the banker comes out to meet him at the arrival of the young man, and all of the previous week's animosity, and sort of intensity seems gone, because he is so sure that this young man isn't going to last even just a couple months, if a couple weeks, inside the isolation situation that he has created. So the banker leads the young man cordially back behind the mansion to a little cottage. It's a 1-bedroom cottage in the middle of a field, sort of situated on top of a nice green grassy hill. And it's in view of the mansion so that the banker can keep an eye on the young man just in case there is, any sort of trickery about. But it's far enough away so that the young man would be completely alone. And the banker shows him around the cottage. It's just 1 bedroom. It's got a table, a bed, it has a little stove. But other than that, there's essentially nothing in this cottage. And the banker sets out the rules of the bet. He essentially says that there will be strict adherence to the following. The young man must reside and completely stay inside this cottage. He cannot go outside even once. The doors will be sealed so that if at any moment the seals are broken, everyone will know that the young man has left the cottage. The young man will not be allowed to see a human. The young man will not be allowed to hear a human voice. There will be no outside letters or newspapers or anything modern or contemporary allowed inside the cabin. The young man will in every way be completely severed from modern human civilization. That being said, there are things which are allowed that will allow the young man things to do while he waits through the entire 15 years. He will be allowed musical instruments. He can be allowed food and wine and tobacco if he'd like to smoke in a pipe. He is especially allowed any book that the young man can come up with wanting. Anything from any genre is totally fine as long as it's not a modern newspaper. And the bet is completely off if at any moment the young man leaves, even if it's 2 minutes before the end of the 15-year sentence. The $2 million does not have to be paid out to the young man, obviously, and they're going to start the bet at exactly noon, November 14th, 1870, and the bet will officially end at noon sharp, November 14th, 1885. The young man sticks his chin up proudly, declares that he is satisfied with the rules of engagement, and the very next day, November the 14th, the young man enters the cottage, the door is shut, and the bet begins. The banker, too lazy and too rich to ensure that the young man keeps all the rules, hires a gardener to take care of the young man and ensure that no tomfoolery is had during the duration of the bet. The gardener is the one who fields all of the young man's requests. He is the one who brings him food and books and musical instruments as needed, and he supplies these by using a small window, but only when the young man is asleep. The gardener is able to sort of peer in slightly through the crack. There's like a little way he can see in. Let's call it a peephole in the window, or it's maybe a one-way. I'm not sure exactly. I don't quite remember how the short story described, but regardless, the gardener is able to deliver items and sort of check in on the prisoner. He's able to see the prisoner, but the prisoner or young man is not able to see the gardener. So what is going on this first year in the cottage? The banker asks the gardener frequently, "So, how is our young man doing in his self-appointed prison?" And the gardener reports during the entire first year that a piano can be heard playing within the cottage. This is something he requested. It took several men to get it in, but it was like 3 a.m. and they were able to do it and then reseal the seals while the young man was completely asleep, I suppose. And the music played by the piano is dreary. It's just little plinking sounds that aren't very fun, and it seems to be very melancholy. And the gardener also reports to the banker that no wine or tobacco was requested after a couple months because, according to a letter from the prisoner inside, those items make the young man feel desire. And after even just a couple months, the young man wants nothing but to feel numb and just embrace the loneliness. The gardener does report, however, that some books had been ordered, but they were light. Love stories, high fantasy, sensational, mysteries and fun novels that are more meant to spark imaginative storytelling and, worlds abroad. And the banker, surprised that the young man has lasted a couple of months even, is pretty sure after even 1 year from the sound of the dreary piano and the refusal of wanting anything that makes desire spark and just wants to become numb, that the young man is on his way out of the bet. The $2 million will almost certainly be secured. He will not have to pay it out. Year 2, this is further confirmed as the piano goes completely silent. No music is being played in this entire year, reports the gardener. However, the book selection has changed. The gardener reports that the man seems to be going through the great classics: War and Peace, Moby Dick, the Wind in the Willows, Robinson Crusoe, and this sort of interests the banker. I keep saying baker. It's so funny. I apologize. I need to work on my diction. And at this point, the banker starts to forget about the young man. 15 years is a long time, and he sort of lets the gardener and the young man go on autopilot. But he remembers the bet 5 years after 5 years have passed, and he calls upon the gardener to give a report after 5 years. And the gardener reports, surprisingly, that music is audible again. Wine has been asked for. In fact, when the gardener has had a chance to peek in and see what's going on inside of the cottage, he was shocked to see that the young man had grown very overweight. He had eaten so much and had gorged himself on wine and excess food. And it seemed that all day he was just yawning, practicing musical instruments, talking to himself, and having fits of random anger, almost as if the man seemed to be going mad a little bit. The gardener reported that one of the more disturbing things he had seen the young man do was spend time writing furiously at his one little desk with ink and pen, with quill and ink. And he would write and write, even sometimes deep into the night, with just a little candle to provide light through the dark, midnight hours. And then, come the cock crow in the morning, the young man would tear up all of the paper that he had previously written on in a fury of dissatisfaction and discontent. And then he would softly but surely break into tears. And the banker, hearing this update, sort of shakes his head and says to the gardener, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that his sanity is in question, but surely we should see him break at any moment and ask to leave the house. I hope this has been a valuable lesson for him, but the $2 million payout is certainly safe." But another year and a half passes, And at the 6th year and some change, about a 6.5 year mark, the gardener reports to the banker a little bit hesitantly, holding his hat that he always wears, that's a little bit scuffed with dirt, in between his hands, fidgeting slightly, that there has been a notable change in the countenance of the young man. In fact, the books that the young man has been requesting have greatly increased in intensity, in scholarship. The young man appears to have become a zealous student of language, philosophy, history. The gardener could hardly keep up with his requests. At one point, the gardener had even received a note from the young man, the first one in years. And the note said, "I have written in 6 different languages a paragraph in this note. Please take this to masters of one of each 6 languages. Have them check it, and please fire off a gun in the garden to let me know and inform me that my translation of their languages from paragraph to paragraph has been correct. I am deeply fascinated to know how my language study is progressing in the opinion of these language masters." The banker, completely aghast at the progress seemingly the young man has suddenly made in this turn towards scholarship, shrugs his shoulders, figuring that a gunshot is not a human voice, nor is a human being, and allows the request. But he asks that the gardener shoot twice, just to maybe confuse things up a bit. Then, in the 10th year, the gardener reports, surprisingly, that the young man has ordered nothing but a small copy of the Gospels, which constitute the first 4 books of the New Testament in the Bible. The banker found this extraordinarily weird. This young man, this prisoner, had practically ordered upwards of 600, just hundreds of books previously, based on all of these different subjects. And then he goes and wastes a year on some dinky little thin book. The banker just could not understand. And towards the end of that year, the gardener reported that the prisoner started to order books on theology and more history. Finally, the last 2 years of the bet came about, and with this, an immense surge in the quantity of all kinds of volumes that the young man requested. From natural science to Shakespeare to chemistry, medicine, treatises on political science and theology, everything you could think of, the young man was absorbing like a sponge, rapidly tearing through all of the worlds in multiple language knowledge centers and just becoming probably the expert on multiple subjects. Towards the end of the 15th year, the banker started to get more and more uneasy. All of a sudden, his confidence that he would not have to pay the young man $2 million was rapidly diminishing. To make matters worse, the banker, 15 years ago, at the mansion in the rain, slopping wine around the room, had millions and millions, so much money that he probably didn't even know. He didn't even have an accounting of it because he was so unworried about the amount of wealth he had acquired. But through poor decision making and excessive gambling on the stock market, he now wasn't sure if he even had enough assets to cover the liabilities he owed. He was almost scared to look at his books. He may be broke, but certainly he did not have $2 million that he owed the young man. What was he going to do? This was a serious breach of contract. He couldn't even imagine the legal ramifications the young man would hold against them if he did not serve his side of the bet at the end of the 15th year. This haunted the banker. He couldn't sleep. He developed insomnia. He started to be unable to eat. He chewed his fingernails and paced relentlessly around the mansion, hoping one day, but knowing that the young man would never leave and that he would ultimately win the bet. Finally, on the eve of the final day, the night of November 13th, the banker decides that something must be done. This is too much. He cannot stand the thought of the young man leaving the house, living a happy life, marrying, even gambling of his own and blowing it all in the stock market, all of the 2 million, and saying the entire time, "Oh, thank you, Mr. Banker. You are the one who made all of this possible. Thank you for making that silly bet and losing it so that I could lord this over you." This was too much for the banker. And at 3 a.m., in the darkest of night, when even the crickets were quiet, the banker snuck out of his mansion, crossed the field, and climbed the green hill toward the little isolated the cottage, where the young man lay asleep on his final night. He, knowing what he was about to do, hesitated. If he killed the young man, who would be to blame? But then the banker remembered. He was still considered by society to be quite successful and wealthy. The blame would almost certainly fall upon the gardener. And with this worry assuaged, the banker continued on with his evil plot. He took a closer look at the cottage, sneaking around to make sure that absolutely no one was about, but there was no one. The cottage was extremely isolated. Only the sounds of the wind through distant trees could be heard. The banker himself tried to peek through the window that the gardener often used to deliver the countless books, but he could barely see inside the house. There only seemed to be an outline of the young man, leaned upon his desk, seemingly sleeping. Books and their outlines, blurry through the dirty window, seemed to be strewn about everywhere. It was almost like a library had exploded its contents all over the interior of the cottage, and books lay strewn about hither and thither. The bed was made and seemed to be almost unused. The stove was still there, but the predominant dressing in the room was absolutely the books and the figure of the young man lying motionless over the desk. The banker decided that it was now or never. He wished the young man was in the bed. It would look better if he was in the bed with what he was about to do. But leaned up against the desk would have to do for now. He didn't have any more time left. And without further ado, the banker undid the seals on the door, which had still been intact, used the spare key he had, and opened the door soundlessly. He entered the cottage quietly, ensuring that not even the floorboards creaked, and approached the young man slowly. In the moonlight, peering very faintly through the windows, lighted upon the young man's demeanor, the young man could not be called a young man anymore. In fact, he almost looked like a skeleton. Long curly hair descended past his shoulders, almost the length of a normal woman's in the late 1800s. He had a light blonde shaggy beard, but his face had a yellow earthen complexion to it. It was drawn tightly around his skull, the skin hollow, the cheeks sunken. The young man looked like he had not been nourishing himself the last couple years, seemingly obsessed with instead digesting the knowledge of countless, hundreds books. The banker's plan was simple and sinister. He went to the bed, picked up the pillow, and planned to smother the young man. Originally, he was scared of a struggle. Who knew if the young man, his physical condition could be better than the banker's, who had also aged 15 years and was not looking nearly as skinny as the young man had at this point. But based on the young man's pallid complexion and weak arms, the banker had a feeling that he would have no trouble suffocating the young man to death, and that even the most expert coroner at the time probably would shrug and not do a very thorough inspection of what had happened, citing that the young man looked sickly enough to die in the night. It just happened that it would be perfect timing to lose the bet. The banker grabs the pillow, slowly leans over the young man, takes one big breath, and right before he descends, his eyes lit on a piece of paper sticking out of the elbow of the young man who was leaning over the desk. He was covering a small piece of paper that was sticking out a little bit past his elbow. And curious, figuring that a couple seconds difference wouldn't make too big a deal, the banker pulls it out slyly and takes a look at what the young man must have been looking at in his last night of incarceration. Fascinated, the banker looks and finds that it is a letter, shockingly, to him of all people. And the letter reads, "Tomorrow at 12 o'clock, I regain my freedom and the right to associate with other men. But before I leave this room and see the sunshine, I think it necessary to say a few words to you, banker. With a clear conscience, I tell you, as before God, who beholds me, that I despise freedom and life and health and all that in your books is called the good things of the world. For 15 years, I have been intently studying earthly life. It is true that I have not seen the earth nor men, but in your books I have drunk fragrant wine. I have sung songs. I have hunted stags and wild boars in the forest, have loved women, beauties as ethereal as clouds, created by the magic of your poets and geniuses, have visited me at night and have whispered in my ears wonderful tales that have set my brain in a whirl. In your books I have climbed to the peaks of Elburz and Mount Blanc, and from there I have seen the sun rise and have watched it at evening flood the sky, the ocean, and the mountaintops with gold and crimson. I have watched from there the lightning flashing over my head and cleaving the storm clouds. I have seen green forests, fields, rivers, lakes, towns. I have heard the singing of the sirens and the strains of the shepherd's pipes. I have touched the wings of comely devils who flew down to converse with me of God. In your books I have flung myself into the bottomless pit, performed miracles, slain, burned towns, preached new religions, conquered whole kingdoms. Your books have given me wisdom. All that the unresting thought of man has created in the ages is compressed into the small compass of my brain. I know that I am wiser than all of you. And yet I despise your books. I despise wisdom and the blessings of this world. It is all worthless, fleeting, illusory, and deceptive, like a mirage. You may be proud, banker, wise and fine, but death will wipe you off the face of the earth as though you were no more than mice burrowing under the floor. And your posterity, your history, your immortal geniuses will burn or freeze together with the earthly globe. All have lost their reason and taken the wrong path, humanity itself. You have taken lies for truth and hideousness for beauty. Humanity would marvel if, owing to strange events of some sorts, frogs and lizards suddenly grew on apple and orange trees instead of fruit, or if roses began to smell like a sweating horse. So I marvel at you, including you, banker, who exchange heaven for earth. I don't want to understand you. To prove to you in action how I despise all that you live by, I renounce the 2 million of which I once dreamed of as a paradise, and which I now despise. To deprive myself of the right to the money, I shall go out from here 5 hours before the time fixed, and so break the compact. The banker, upon reading this letter in the moonlight, stood amazed. He very slowly backed up, put the pillow back on the bed, and left the cottage as silently as he could. Tears and emotion kept him hours for sleeping. The next morning, as expected, the gardener burst into the mansion, cleaving the great doors in two and screaming, "He's gone! He's gone! The young man, he's gone!" All of the servants rushed outside, shocked that the bet would be broken so soon before the final hours were complete. But the banker was slow to move. The only thing the banker was sure to do was steal into the cottage and take the note that the young man had written and lock it up in a fireproof case in his house. He did not want to avoid arousing unnecessary talk. And for the rest of his life, he would be thinking about the young man and the bet.